Welcome everyone to this online launch event of the NORRAG Special Issue number 7, Education in Times of Climate Change. This webinar is to launch the 7th edition of the NORRAG Special Issue. And we are talking here about education in times of climate change. And the long and deep historical engagement with the environment in education has gained increasing attention recently due to the recognition of contemporary climate emergency and its effects on the planet, and also particularly on people and societies, and therefore on education. And this is extremely important in terms of education, providing ways to conceptualize futures, to recreate, transgress, and transform imperfect presents by engaging learners in defining and meeting the needs of a future that they themselves are reimagining. Very importantly, this NORRAG Special Issue does not fall into the trap of separating out environment from society, from economics. Instead, the contributors are charting a course for educators with their learners, institutions, and society more broadly, to build towards more sustainable and also more just futures. Both of those aspects come through very strongly in this, as they should. If you would like to share NSI 7 on social media or any key messages that you hear in this webinar that resonate with you, please do use these Twitter handles for NORRAG, the Graduate Institute, and then also Rhodes University and the Environmental Learning and Research Center. And these are the hashtags that we would suggest, but obviously feel free to use the ones that resonate most with you. And I'm very happy now to hand the floor over to distinguished Professor Heila Lotz-Sisitka at the Environmental Learning Research Center at Rhodes University, South Africa, one of our 2 fantastic guest editors for this special issue, and Eureta will be moderating the panel after this. But immediately now, Heila.
Thank you very much, Moira, and good afternoon to everybody, and a very big welcome. It's such an exciting day for us to be here after 2 years of working on. I would just like to acknowledge the colleagues that have been working with us, and of course all of the authors. That's quite a number I see have joined us this afternoon. So I'm going to just do a very brief introduction to the journal, just to give you a sense of what we were intending and also what is sitting inside the journal. And really what I'm able to offer is just a very, very high level perspective. So the detail really is in the actual journal itself, and we will of course be encouraging everybody to download it and access it as soon as they can after this session here today. So I am from Rhodes University. Eureta and myself, we both work at Rhodes University, where we work in a center called the Environmental Learning Research Center, which has been active for 30 years now, and we've been working in this area of education for quite some time. So it was very exciting for us to have this opportunity to bring this journal together, and we're very grateful to Moira and the team for inviting us to edit this journal. So here we are. This is our team. Myself, Eureta, we were the co-editors, and of course we had the wonderful Colleen, who was helping us with the journal processing, and I think all of the authors will be very happy to see Colleen there, because she has been on doing all of the back-end communications over the 2-year period. So what is the issue of this issue? And I think Moira has already introduced the fact that we are really facing quite some big challenges on our planet and looking into the future. And I think we all know now that there is no doubt that our Earth systems are impacted by anthropogenic climate change, and this is unprecedented in the history of humanity. So we're facing an incredibly uncertain future. And the impacts of climate change are already very evident. It's not something that's still coming, it's something that is already with us. And I guess we're trying to arrest this challenge. And of course, so the efforts to arrest temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius are currently still failing, so is that it has massive consequences for those that are already most vulnerable. So ramping up climate change education is both urgent and it's also necessary. But the problem is that this will only be transformative if education systems, pedagogies, and so on are radically transformed themselves. And this is the issue in the issue, if I could say that. What we were trying to grapple with was how does one deal with the need to transform society while also having a transformed education. So this is what we've tried to bring to the surface in the issue. And we're also trying to respond to the sort of big social messages that we're really needing system change, not climate change. And then what does that actually look like when we begin to look into the education system? So we've taken a multi-dimensional perspective on this in the journal, taking the seriousness of the issue to heart, and then really getting into the depth of what this means for education. So the purpose of the journal, NORRAG, as you know, is a network for international cooperation and for international policies and cooperation in education and training. And so we were really trying to surface policy implications for education in times of climate change from voices that are not ordinarily heard. And this is very important as you approach the journal. We are not the world's biggest policymakers or academics or anything. We are actually a cluster. Also wanted perspectives that were grounded in praxis, that were research-based. We wanted conversation with the wider geopolitical landscape. We didn't want to provincialize ourselves. We wanted transformative and richly textured perspectives. And we wanted a strong mix of early career researchers and more experienced researchers. So as we bring to you what is in this issue, that's what we were trying to do as we set it up. So in the journal itself, we've covered a number of themes. So the first theme gives us overview perspectives. The second theme looks at the third theme, looks at the relationships. The fourth theme looks at engaging diverse knowledges in climate change response. The fifth theme speaks to young people and the call for climate action. And of course, we've seen that so widely spread across the planet. And the sixth theme is giving a lot of attention to children's voices in climate action. The seventh theme is focusing on transforming higher education for sustainable futures. And the eighth theme is focusing on inclusive, responsive educational transformations in service of these 8 themes. And we have a wonderful array of contributions from across the planet. So we have 28 contributions that are structured into those 8 themes. We will hear from some of our contributors later in the panel discussion. But unfortunately, we were not able to bring all 28 contributors or contributions or the 75 authors onto the platform today with us. So we really are just relying on a few of them to help you get a flavor of the journal in the South and the North, the West and the East, and multidimensional vantage points that nonetheless converge around this critical issue for our times, climate, how to deal with education in times of climate change. So there's some headlines that are I've just touched on very, very quickly and at a very high level. But what the journal does, some of the headlines highlights, is that it shares with us what is currently being done to transform education. It also shares with us ways to expand learning and engage with diverse knowledges. It gives us to think through how to engage with young people and to listen to children's views and voices. So that's just a few very high level headlines. And I hope you will, poke into the journal and really get into some of these lovely papers that are there. So in terms of the policy connections and implications, we try to also look across all of the contributions and say, well, what is this actually saying about the current state of policy and, climate change education, or education and climate change, that relationship. And one of the things that stands out is that, for example, through the Fridays for Futures movement, we can see that young people do actually care, and they are reclaiming agency in building their own futures. And I guess what that has raised across the world is education ready for young demands for contemporary relevance in education? And overall, it seems not yet. And there's been a number of studies that have been coming through. I think Aaron has been quite involved in some of them. But this is just some stats from the UNESCO and Educational International's work, that 47% of 100 countries make no reference to climate change in their curricula. And there was also a finding that 95% of teachers want to teach about climate change, but only 55% have received training. So some of these items are in the front of the journal, you can begin to see, and we want to really speak to these kinds of challenges in the system as a whole. So a clear policy message in the journal is that education in times of climate change must be genuinely transformative, if not transgressive. And one of the things that we've also talked a lot to in the journal is that education about the environment or climate challenges is important, but it's not enough. And ultimately, we need education for, in, through, and with the environment, in community with others, orientated towards alternative futures, more creative, open-minded, connected, yet critically orientated types of education. And this kind of education needs to be holistically grounded in the cultures of people, but it also needs to be regenerative. And I think we'll hear some perspectives on that as we go forward. And of course, all of this is very much relevant to the move to try to rethink what quality education means as we go forward in our society. So this is a little quote from UNESCO, which, to be quite honest, is one of my favorite policy quotes of all times. And it comes from the World ESD Conference. It's the last statement that came out of the recent World ESD Conference. And it says that transformative learning for people and the planet is a necessity for our survival and that of future generations. The time to learn and act for our planet is now. And we need to give attention to this notion of transformative learning. And for example, in our research program, we've been working on, transformative learning, transgressive learning, transdisciplinary learning, together learning, and really trying to think through, what is the full meaning of this notion of transformative learning, because that sits at the heart of all of the rest of what we would like to see education doing as we go forward. So with this in mind, our sort of final review in terms of what this means for policy is that the idea of a top-down policy, we should rather invite policymakers to join hands with, to see and to listen to educators who are developing emerging solutions and recommendations for policy shifts across the system. And I hope that our journal can bring some of those to the surface. And that policy itself is a learning process. And we need to, together engage in ongoing practice and our pedagogies, learn from our actions in order to concept of transformation that is so urgent and so critical. And our panelists, and they'll be talking in the edition. And Eureta will also introduce our different panelists, and then I'll just be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we'll enjoy the conversation going forward. So thank you very much for that time to give you a little introduction. So I think, Eureta, you can take over now from me.
Thank you very much, Heila. And I'm so thankful that your connectivity held out there and that you were able to make that last point, that policy in itself is a learning process. I think a very powerful point on which to end. So colleagues, now we're going to introduce you to some of the wonderful authors who contributed to the special issue. And we're going to start with Professor Erin Benavo from State University of New York. Erin is at University at Albany. He's also a lead member of the Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change, Communication and Education, the MECI project in the United States. Erin has, like all the other authors, been given a very strict brief of 3 to 5 minutes. He's just going to open up his paper for us. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Eureta, and thank you, both Marcy and I, thank you very much for inviting us to contribute to this very special issue. We're delighted to see that it finally is being launched, and we hope that it circulates widely. Next slide, please. Marcy and I have prepared a short piece that really speaks to issues around kind of leverage points and how certainly academics and researchers that have a keen interest in issues around climate change, education, communication can, as it were, mobilize their knowledge and skills and interest in order to bring about fundamental change. Our paper is organized in the 4 areas that you see on the slide here. And the main point really of our contribution is to emphasize how comparative policy research that draws on diverse approaches, conceptualizations, and methods represents an important leverage point for fostering change in climate change policy and practice. Overall, that's really the key message that we hope people will take away from our piece. Next slide, please. We do think, as we embark on trying to conceive of this leverage, that it's important to consider different frameworks, different heuristics that talk about ways to, who are the people that we're trying to have some influence, where are they located, how might this influence be best eventuated. Obviously, there are many different leverage points that one could consider using in intervening and providing some kind of platform for action. But it's also, we think, important to understand there needs to be some alignment between the tools and approaches that we would choose or select in relationship to these leverage points. So if you're working with young people, then it's obviously very important to engage in participatory research. If you're seeking to strengthen educational practice, then it's important to interview educators and NGOs that are working in the field. And from our perspective, if we're trying to understand and inform policymakers and policy reform, then it's important to engage in comparative and collaborative policy research. Next slide, please. So we talk about the importance then of selecting a kind of a strategic methodology that focuses on how research can intersect with kind of critically fostering social change. And obviously, as I've indicated, different heuristics or different frameworks would point to different leverage points. We certainly, in the work that we have been involved in, have focused on the political sphere of action. And clearly, the target audience that we have are government authorities, policymakers at fairly high level, and in particular, those involved in various kinds of intergovernmental discussions around climate issues, and in particular, around issues of climate communication and education. Next slide, please. So given that the intended sphere of action for our work is really the political, and that we wish to inform national governments in providing practical technical responses to how they can best incorporate various modes or modalities of climate change education and communication in their policies, we've been mobilizing, we've been compiling a very large number of official educational policy documents and curricular framework documents in order to capture the extent and type of climate, biodiversity, and environmental focus that are included in these documents. We read them carefully depending on the kind of document involved. And in some instances, given the quantity of materials that we're looking at, we also engage in more text query analysis in order to identify relevant content and also provide examples of a more qualitative kind. One of the focus of our work is to really think about climate change learning and education as a multidimensional phenomena. So we're not just interested in looking at knowledge and the cognitive dimensions, but also looking at social, psychological, and participatory dimensions. We think it's very important to see the extent to which countries are including them in their intended policy and curricular documents. And clearly we believe, and that's part of the reason that we focus on these other dimensions, that if you're really trying to foster climate change among young learners, that it's very important to engage them emotionally, socially, and culturally in this regard. Next slide, please. So the MEIS project is essentially the monitoring and evaluating climate communication project, is trying to make available in a very systematic way comparative data and policy information for all countries and civil society organizations. We hope to advance new opportunities for advocacy and benchmarking in this area of climate change communication education that enables policymakers to target set both within their countries and also regionally and internationally. In this area, at least at the international level, there's been a dearth of policy evidence in our view, and so we really think that we're helping to kind of fill a void that is very critical in furthering conversations in this area. And we also think that it's incredibly important to work across different boundaries to ensure that the research that we're working on really speaks to many different scholars, researchers, focus on different aspects of climate communication and education, and that they can be involved in different points of intervention. And so, please, last slide. Really then, as we go forward, we think that the way to advance climate change communication and education, that policy is an important leverage point, policy change and reform. Climate change education is one domain, and it's through combining comparative policy analysis with collaborative research in this area that we think that we can contribute together with colleagues to significant climate action. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Erin, and to Marcia McKenzie as well for that paper, which actually leads in the journal and is the first paper in theme 1. I'd like to invite Christina Kwok, Dr. Christina Kwok, to join us now and present her paper, which also responds to theme 1. Christina works as an education consultant, also in the US, and her paper is titled Towards Climate Justice, Lessons from Girls' Education. Over to you, Christina. Okay, I've just been informed that perhaps Christina has dropped off the connection. If that is the case, I would like to then invite Dr. Sarah van Borek, who is Canadian-South African, a scholar from the Environmental Learning Research Center here at Rhodes University. And Sarah is going to take us into theme 2, with the transgression of boundaries, and her paper is titled Towards an Unhidden Curriculum. And as Sarah gets ready to present, I hope she is, I see that people are already contributing questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much for doing that. Please continue to do so. Sarah, are you ready?
Thanks very much, Eureta. It's a huge honor to be here with everyone today. If this was the first day of a class that I was teaching in a university course, and if we were all together in person, one of the first activities that I would do as an icebreaker is that I would invite each of us to form a kind of human line from one end of the room to the other, where one end would represent one language, and the other end of the room would represent as many languages as one person might be fluent in. And as an icebreaker, the task would be for everyone to speak amongst each other to be able to organize ourselves into this line of languages. And once everyone had settled, then I would call on a few people to share how many languages you're fluent in and which languages. From there, I then bridge into explaining how languages are really a huge strength and a tool that we have, especially in an educational environment, and that it's something that I would encourage learners to use in my class, especially when we're using.
Sorry, apologies, the microphone went off.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great, okay, so just to pick up there, so while I may be required to teach a class in a particular language like English, I do have an opportunity like this to establish right at the start of a class, a practice of valuing a diversity of ways of knowing that may be embedded in language. I consider language as one potential aspect of what I refer to as the unhidden curriculum, which is the key policy point from my paper that I'll speak a bit more about today. In my article called Towards an Unhidden Curriculum, I refer to a graduate water justice course called Making Waveforms that I co-designed and facilitated at the University of Cape Town's Future Water Research Institute in collaboration with Rhodes University's Environmental Learning Research Center here in South Africa in 2019. Just to give you a bit of a picture of the course, it combines self-filming, that's making films on smartphones, with a public screening to foster a university community or formal, informal knowledge commons around water narratives. The process of students developing their self-films included recording videos and sounds of local water bodies, and also documenting life experience storytelling with knowledge keepers. I use the term knowledge keepers to refer to people outside the university and academia, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with existing relationships to the water bodies. The course had two key aims. One, to raise awareness of the importance of local waterways using media arts-based tools, and two, to meaningfully integrate knowledge, knowers, and perspectives traditionally excluded from higher education curricula. In my article, I propose a decolonizing approach to climate change education that both values and creates bridges between informal and formal learning systems and the populations that they can each meaningfully involve. I refer to this approach as the unhidden curriculum. This draws on what a South African scholar named Lagrange called the hidden curriculum, where he was referring to the dominant institutional culture and its values. To apply an unhidden curriculum means to strategically make visible the hidden curriculum, while through a process of emergence, addressing previously absent elements of the curriculum in ways that support decolonizing aims. With the Making Waveforms course in my article, some examples of how the hidden curriculum was made visible include: one, using the term knowledge keepers for people outside academia with life experience knowledge of water bodies and integrating them into the course in a meaningful way to highlight and value the knowledge that they brought. Two, showcasing students' self-films, which were promoting narratives of valuing water in a free public event. This presented the course as serving both the registered students and the wider community and ecosystem. And three, audiovisual recording assignments, where students found value in spending time observing and documenting water bodies. This demonstrated the institutional values of reinvigorating life rather than prioritizing an economy dependent on the destruction of it. Following the Making Waveforms course, interviews were conducted with students. Students' responses revealed a sense of a horizontal knowledge co-production between and amongst students and teachers. This really helped me to see the value of the unhidden curriculum in shifting power structures, those often at the root of climate injustices, not just between formal and informal learning structures, but also within a formal learning structure itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for taking us right into the heart of your practice in the higher education context and reflecting on the boundary crossings there. Can I see whether Christina is back on the call? Fantastic. So welcome, Christina, welcome back. And we'd like to hear about your paper from theme 1 towards climate justice.
Thank you so much, Eureta. And I apologize, the Zoom gremlins got the best of me today. So just to get it started, I wanted to take a moment to, definitely celebrate the successes that have been made in pockets around the world to increase attention to climate change and education. I think many, perhaps all of us in this Zoom room today are here because we understand the important role that education has to play in our collective responses and actions to tackling the climate crisis. But as we, as a global climate and education community, begin to shepherd more actors in the direction of education for climate action, I think it's also time that we take the next step and really strive toward an education that achieves climate justice. So this means we have to recognize that not all climate action is made equal, nor should it be, because those who are least responsible for the climate crisis are not only the ones on the front lines experiencing the worst effects of climate change, but they're also often the ones least equipped with the social and financial capital and resources to engage in climate action to adapt to these effects. And this is because of the historic legacy of colonialism, sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and exploitation, all systems and structures that also function to cut off many of these the climate vulnerable populations from equal access to quality education. And so the climate crisis is a climate justice issue, and education for climate action that perpetuates social and economic systems of inequality is not the kind of education we need for a truly sustainable and inclusive future on this planet. So in this context, the goal of getting all governments to include climate change in national curricula, or the goal to get all teachers in all subject areas to teach climate change, these should be thought of as our minimum standard, our first step in a multi-step journey towards transformative change. And importantly, this journey also includes critically examining and radically transforming, as Heila and everyone have said so far in this webinar, really radically transforming how we, quote unquote, do education. So what we teach, what we measure, how we measure, and most importantly, what we teach and measure for. So this point about examining the purpose of education in the context of the climate crisis is my point of departure in my contribution to this special issue. So calling for, education for climate justice as a new bar to reach for is not necessarily an arbitrary act of shifting the goalposts, but in fact, as my research on the nexus of gender and education and climate change progressed, I realized that as I was going from climate change education to education for climate action to education for climate empowerment, and then now education for climate justice, I was reminded of a very similar progression in another field, in girls' education, my own professional community and the field that taught me about the significance of climate change. So Moria, if I could get the first slide in my series of slides to go up, that'd be great. This is the point where I'd like to talk a little bit about this. So this brings me again to the core contribution of my essay, which was to draw insights from girls' education and the decades of efforts working to achieve gender equality in education that stakeholders in that field have been making, and trying to apply these, if you want to go to the next slide, that'd be great, applying these lessons to the field of climate and education, all in an effort to help us in climate and education save decades of time iterating between implementation, research, and learning, and to instead help fast track us to a more intentional approach to designing and delivering an education that tackles climate change and achieves climate justice. Again, all within a quickly closing window of time that we have left to take meaningful action. Moria, if you could go back to the previous one, that'd be great. While the goal for girls' education stakeholders was always clear, implementation often fell short because program design wasn't always aligned to the vision. And over time, we began to see in the field of girls' education, the field gradually beginning to harmonize around terminology, which is captured in this continuum. And this really helps the field to begin to fundamentally shift how gender equality and education program was designed and for what purpose, whether fixing or empowering the individual to addressing root causes of gender inequality at the systems level. More if we can go to the next slide again, thanks. So similarly here in this figure, what I've attempted to do in my contribution is to help us potentially harmonize our terminology around this nexus of education and climate change with the goal of achieving climate justice for frontline communities and marginalized populations. So this continuum is in no means meant to be, you know, a final continuum, but really intended to help spark critical reflection on what we do in education and spark critical debate on how we do this in ways that will hopefully help the field transgress and transform legacies of colonialism and patriarchy by expanding mindsets, shifting paradigms, and building skills for political agency and solidarity and collective action. So that's all I wanted to say for now. Thank you so much. And thanks again for your patience with the technical difficulties on my end. Thanks.
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much, Christina, for that wonderful analysis that you presented there of so much research that you have done in that field. Now, moving on to our fourth speaker, we're going to come to theme 3 in the journal, which looks at the diversity of knowledges and the importance of drawing on the diversity of knowledges when it comes to climate education, which is a theme that Sarah has already opened and Heila has also referred to in her opening slides. So welcome to Professor Rosa Guadalupe Mendoza Zuani from the University of Veracruz in Mexico. And we're looking forward to hearing about the rethinking of school community participation in climate change in Mexico. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this launch event and for giving me the opportunity to talk about our contribution as a team into this special issue. It's a great honor to be amongst you. First of all, I would like to highlight the context of our contribution. Our research as a team of researchers and postgraduate students chose and promotes new forms of school community participation, particularly in rural and indigenous schools in Mexico. All of this around the issue of climate change. Schools in Mexico have failed to address climate change. Besides, related local and indigenous knowledge practices are undervalued and almost absent from educational processes. In our contribution, we argue that exploring climate change at school from a situated and active perspective, including local knowledge and practices developed by families and community members, contributes to understand it, and most importantly, to generate situated action to find solutions. So we emphasize transforming practices upon indigenous and local knowledge to build a different way to be in the planet. We argue for rethinking and refocusing families and communities' participation around teaching and curricula. And this should be based on the most relevant local concerns, making use of the knowledge of families and the practice they perform daily. This argument stems from Paulo Freire's alert on the epistemological error, which consists on not including in schools what people know and do in their daily lives. So our project involves action through training of basic education teachers for designing and implementing learning progressions inspired by the work of Anne Edwards, which was adapted by Rob O'Donoghue from the South African context, and then readapted for the Mexican context by our team. This readapted Mexican version put special emphasis on stories as containers of knowledge and concerns of marginalized voices at schools, and even more in the design of educational policies. So our proposal includes a 4-quadrant model for designing learning progressions as materials not only for teachers, but also for students. And these materials focus on local socio-ecological concerns identified by teachers and families, knowledge and practices of families and community members linked to the school curriculum. So we use this four-quadrant learning progression model to make a situated learning process that transform the way in which families have historically engaged with schools. And I have to say that schools have been largely excluded local knowledge in their educational processes. So our chair aim with authors of contributions to this special issue is to bridge the practice policy gap. So we make some propositions to build public actions oriented to transform the conventional practice of school community participation, which can influence decision makers, either policy makers at the national or subnational levels, or on-the-ground practitioners as teachers in schools. We find particularly important to make visible this kind of marginalized forms of expertise emerging from universities' research projects engaged in collaboration with teachers and families. And these hardly constitute evidence for educational policies in Mexico, I have to say that. So the main policy recommendation included in our contribution is to take seriously the importance of providing supportive training for teachers in relevant situated learning approaches. This to face the current socio-ecological crisis. With a supportive training model that we have developed, teachers can learn to recognize the context in which they work from a social and ecological perspective. Socially, the teachers find out that family knowledge is relevant for their teaching processes. And ecologically, teachers learn that the concerns associated with climate change are interconnected, giving them the opportunity to link the school curriculum to the environmental context. So the main lesson is to conceive teachers as agents of innovation and change, and families as bearers of valuable knowledge to transform our way to be in this planet and to face climate change through education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lupita. I think our audience members are by now very, very keen not only to access the journal papers, but also to access the recordings of these wonderful presentations. Please rest assured the links will be made available at the end of the session, which is at 12:30 in about an hour's time. Next, I would like to welcome and introduce Professor John Holmberg, who is the UNESCO Chair of Education for Sustainable Development. John is from Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg in Sweden, and we look forward to hearing about your paper, which takes us into the theme around higher education and institutional change in relation to climate education. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Eureta. It's an honor to be here. And I wrote this piece together with Johan Holmér. And I hope my voice will hold. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I hope it will hold. So to dig right into it, United Nations Agenda 2030 has a title, Transforming Our World. That means that business as usual is not an option. We need to transform unsustainable system to a more sustainable system. That is obvious. And what kind of learning is then needed? Gregory Bateson suggested 3 levels of learning. The first level is about doing things better. Almost all learning that is done in schools, corporations, municipalities only reach this first level. We act as we know that we are on the right path and are trying to improve what we already do, focusing on getting the right answers and avoiding mistakes. We often have the feeling of being controlled and measured by people thinking they are in control. We can call this the cruise mode. For transformation, we need to reach the second and third level of learning, the reformative or transformative level in Christina's presentation. It can be seen as an expedition compared to the cruise mode. An expedition helps the cruise ship to find new paths through uncharted water. While the first level of learning is focusing on problem solving, the second level is about doing better things. Here we instead stay with the problem and ask why we have the problem and what the big picture looks like, entering the field of system thinking. It's about addressing the right problem before searching for a solution, and often the solution is to be found somewhere else than we first thought. A good expedition reached the third level of learning, which is about seeing the world anew and asking the question, what is better? This level gives us direction and help us to evaluate the different alternatives on level 2 learning. But reconceiving is difficult. It is hard to learn if you already know. These 3 levels of outside-in learning therefore needs to be supported with inside-out learning. Inside-out learning starts with the recognition that I'm part of the system I seek to change, as pointed out by Peter Senge. It is a reflection on my perspectives. David Bohm said, we do not describe the world we see, but we see the world we describe. And it is also about my willingness to listen to others and challenge my assumptions and goals, asking, how can I be wrong about this, rather than seeking to be right? One might think that higher education institutions are the best institutions in the world to work on higher level of learning. I'm tempted to say that it is the opposite, based on many years struggling with making universities more relevant for sustainable transition. Almost an entire educational system at universities is improved by level 1 learning. And we see very few spaces created for level 2 and 3 learning. When such spaces are created, they are mostly created from bottom up with very little top-down support. In conclusion, to transform our world, we need more expeditions and system thinking in all kinds of organization, not instead of cruise mode, but as an important complement. Higher education institutions must find ways to create space for expedition in the educational system to be relevant for sustainability transition. This is also true for research and innovation at universities. Here, space is needed for expedition in transdisciplinary research and expeditions in systems innovations. Maybe the motto we use at Challenge Lab at Chalmers University can be useful. Think big, start small, act now. Fail fast and learn fast. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you in the Q&A. Our last presenter, and I'm actually very sorry that this is our last author that's going to speak. I'd like to welcome Sydney Mohangi. He is a visiting scholar at University of Nottingham at the moment. He is a PhD registered student at Rhodes University in South Africa. Sydney is from Uganda, and he will be sharing with us some ideas around incubating technical vocational education and training policies in Uganda from a multi-author paper that you will also find in the journal. Over to you, Sydney.
Thank you very much, Prof. Eureta. So as you mentioned, our paper in this issue focuses on TVET and climate change education in Uganda. And so we chose TVET because TVET is a practical component of education, and it's observed as a transformative tool for sustainable development in Africa. Although this is about Uganda, but it applies in other African contexts. So we find that TVET is critical in addressing some of the challenges that we face due to climate change. And UNESCO has also identified TVET as being critical in addressing knowledge and skills challenges to achieving SDGs, and climate change is one of those. So in this paper, we conducted a review of TVET policy in Uganda and some of the literature, including the curricula. And we wanted to understand the extent to which the country has mainstreamed climate change in all these, in its policy and in curricula for TVET. But we also drew from the data that was collected from another project called VET Africa 4.0. And this specifically was on Gulu district, which was one of the cases for this project. So these, the review of the policy and literature and the curricula, but also the primary data we got from the project, they helped to inform our findings. And what we found is that climate change and environment are still missing in Uganda's TVET policy, literature, and the curricula. And this gap really indicates that Uganda is still unprepared to handle some of the challenges that are emerging from climate change. And this is in part due to the lack of skills in sustainable climate practices and environmental management. Again, as I mentioned, these are also applicable in other African contexts. This, as I mentioned, it has got serious implications. This gap has got serious implications. Firstly, Uganda itself is already facing some of the pressures from the climate crisis. And this is mainly affecting the key sector like the agriculture, which is primarily rain-fed. And again, this is the mainstay of the country's economy. Also, Uganda has made some of the commitments to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. For instance, it wants to reduce carbon emission by 22% by 2030. And not having climate change as part of the training curricula for TVET will impede Uganda from achieving its strategic objectives, not only what it has committed to the UN, but also in its policy in development policies such as its Vision 2040 and others. So in this paper, we're making a case. We are arguing for greening TVET. We argue for making a shift in policy and practice in order to bridge this gap to increase climate resilience. And this can be done through incubating entrepreneurial solutions that can drive Uganda's employment and sustainable economic development. And we provide key recommendations. We observe that the Ministry of Education and Sports in Uganda is the lead agency that can help to incorporate this climate change into the national TVET curricula. We see that this can be done by introducing climate change in the study curricula for TVET, but also for teachers. So the teacher training and education curricula should also incorporate climate change. We also see that there's potential if the government, through the Ministry of Education, could challenge and reward students and vocational training institutes to find innovations and green solutions to the local problems. And lastly, we also find that it will be key for the ministry to facilitate partnerships. These could be between training institutions such as universities and other research organizations, including vocational training institutes, private sector innovations, and also some of the work that is being done informally by the youth. And in this paper, we provide an excellent example from Google where the young people are using their vocational skills and engineering skills to recycle plastic waste to make building materials, the tiles. So by creating those partnerships, I believe that this could inform policy and practice in Uganda on climate change. Thank you so much, Prof. Eureta, and everyone for listening in.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And I think there, right at the end, you actually responded to one of the questions in the Q&A, where somebody, it might have been Manoa, I'm not sure, because there's actually a lot of questions there, actually asked about whether we have any examples of climate action that have been taken in our schools, in our colleges, in our universities, in our other institutions, our educational institutions, so that the educational institution is not just about taking action, but it is actually taking action, and learners are involved as well. So if participants on the call have examples that you'd like to share, by all means do that. Would any of our other authors like to come in with perhaps some examples from their context? John, you mentioned working with municipalities, with businesses, corporations as well. I would imagine there are many examples of climate action that could be shared from there. Are our panelists able to unmute?
Yes.
John, is your voice good enough? Would anybody else like to share an example perhaps of climate action? Sydney, over to you.
Sorry, I didn't hear you because I made so much noise myself.
I think, Sydney, you are ready to respond. Am I right?
Yeah, sure. So I can elaborate on the previous example that I mentioned. So in Gulu, the young people decided to start. So this is a startup. It's a company that just formed, and it's for the young people. They decide to take action on environment and climate change, and they are recycling the plastic waste within the city, the city of Gulu, and they are creating tiles. They recycle the plastics and create construction tiles, which they are selling locally and in other parts of the country. Through this, they are creating jobs. The youth are collecting plastic waste and they're getting paid for doing that. So they're contributing to employment, but also to cleaning the city and creating the materials that the country needs, instead of some of these are being imported. So, and what's interesting about these tiles, what we found out was that in case of fire, they will just fall off so that the fire does not spread to other parts of the building. So that's an innovation that I found interesting, pioneered by the youth, and it's also environmentally friendly. Yeah, and they also continue to, they have other programs they're doing, like teaching the community about climate change through the products they're making. So they're also involved in informal learning at the local level.
Thank you very much, Sydney. Would anybody else like to share some examples of climate action from their contexts?
Yes, I can share. I think my experience is that if you create a space like Challenge Lab, where you ask students to be part of not only learning, but creating value for society while learning, and you connect well with society, anything can happen. And we have so many examples, so I cannot just list them, but it has been anything from startups, moving investment from our part of the world in Sweden and the surrounding here to PV installation in Africa. And it's a big thing that started from students, to students being part of connecting stakeholders in my city of Gothenburg to actually start up a process for a new strategy for electromobility in the city, because no one took that responsibility, and the student could take that responsibility. So so on that scale, so many things can happen, and there's so many good examples elsewhere also around the world. But I think that the trick is to create the space for the students and trust them, and just make the connection for them. And then things will start to happen.
Yeah, yeah. And one can't necessarily predict beforehand what will happen.
No, no.
Yeah.
But you are often surprised in a good way.
Yeah. So colleagues, we have also a question around the transformative nature of climate education. There have been some questions and comments, some deep and challenging questions around whether we should be talking about climate change education or about climate justice education. Christina's paper is certainly nudging us towards talking about climate justice education. And in the editorial, when we look across the contributions in this journal, we see that these are really experiments in transformative educational processes. My question to the panel, and anybody could start, is how, in your view, is climate education transformative? I think John and Sydney have actually given us some examples already. Erin, over to you.
So I'm going to take a more conventional view, I think, relative to some of my colleagues. Not that I disagree with them, but I do think that there are ways that we can move forward that are I think very important. So for me, when I think of transformative education from a policy perspective, I think the key thing here is being very comprehensive and holistic in the ways in which policy kind of target or focuses on many different aspects of educational processes. So for me, it's important that educational materials in the curriculum, textbook, lesson plans, intended syllabi, it's important that teachers have opportunities to be prepared and feel confident in bringing important pedagogical practices into the classroom to address some of this content. I think it's important in terms of the way learning is assessed, that there be emphasis placed on outcomes that are not just cognitive and that are not just related to, let's say, more institutionalized subjects. I think it's important that schools and education systems develop new accounting for monitoring and an evaluation of many of the different efforts. So for me, it's transformation is more likely to occur when you have a much more comprehensive and holistic approach that is both systems and also empowering local schools that are all involved in kind of this effort. So I would definitely focus on that particular point.
I see Lupita's hand is up. Please come in, Lupita. But there seems to be echoes in what you're saying, Erin, of John's presentation. We need both cruise mode and expedition mode. Lupita.
Yes. Well, I would like to say that in order to build a transformative education, we need to ask ourselves about how anthropocentric, androcentric, colonial is this education we are put it in the table. So I also ask myself about these words, adaptation, mitigation, as really words or notions that lead us to survive in a way that is transformative, or it are just ways or means to keep on the same road, but just having more time probably. So I think in order to propose transformative education, we need to look at these hegemonic narratives that lead us to continue doing the same thing, maybe just putting different names, but in the Latin American context and in Mexico, it's very important to revise environmental education in these terms. So that's what I want to say, and maybe to provoke reactions about this.
Yeah, and I see a hand from Christina. Please come in.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just want to build off of what the previous two responses were saying. And I think part of the challenge is about thinking about transformative education and sort of transgressive education is, again, asking the question, for what purpose? And I think when we look at some of the sort of the dominant discourse around transformative learning today, a lot of it is focused on transforming the individual, right? So taking that sort of neoliberal approach to really the individual kind of responsibility to, change. And I think when we have something like the climate crisis, that is, again, a systems issue, a systems challenge, transformative learning in terms of, and you can have beautiful processes of transformation at an individual scale where, you see new ways of seeing the world, you have new ways of being in the world and so on. But with a systems issue like this, if we're not also transforming for systems change, that transformation I think we can't tap the full transformative potential of education. And I saw this too in the girls' education field when we were talking about, life skills education or girls' empowerment and so on. It oftentimes stuck at a very individual kind of locus of change and did not seek to tackle the structural structural barriers and the opportunities within her and her environment. And I think we've seen recently that much more intentional shift towards looking at, in the girls' education space, again, not only the girl having, developing leadership and agency and voice and so on, but also thinking about how do we tackle the structures of patriarchy and the structures of inequality, right? And I think the same goes in the context of addressing the climate crisis. If we see the problem is rooted in individual behavioral change, how far is that going to go when we're not shifting as Professor Rosa was saying, the colonial systems and the larger structures of power, invested interests in the fossil fuel industries and so on, for example, how can we really achieve transformative change if we're not also trying to address political agency and collective action and deeper justice? So thank you.
Please come in, Sarah.
Thanks, Eureta. Just building on all of the really important points that everyone said, I think what stands for me also in transformative climate change education is the intersectionality of the issues that we look at. So if I just speak about, for example, trying to address the global water crisis, which is a big focus of my work. Christina's talking about girls' education, and there's so much around the gendered aspects of water injustices. And then Sydney was talking about the agricultural sector in Uganda, and there's so much around food insecurity and the global water crisis. There's also health inequities. And so there's many layers of the intersections of all of these issues when we're talking about justices. And I think that's where there's just so much potential around the transformative nature of this education. Thank you.
I'm a little bit nervous, Heila, to ask you if you wanted to bring anything from the Q&A into this discussion, just because there's quite a lot happening in the Q&A. There's I think some multiple narratives running there, including somebody highlighting for us the importance of refugee children and movements, and many of them climate related. And there is a paper in the journal also addressing that particular aspect. And as we included that paper, we realized that much more needs to be written about this, and we hope that that some of you will follow up and respond to that. But thank you very much for the contributions around this question. The tension between individual agency and structure, I think, Christina, you addressed it very well in the report that you prepared for the Brookings Institute, where you spoke about the role of education in this dialectic space between systems change and individual learning and individual agency. And I wonder if we can find a middle space or second and third learning, as John used, by looking at monitoring and evaluation, which Erin, you've emphasized that as an important dimension that is really ripe for change and transformation. And if there is some significant changes happen there, it could very well be a very significant leverage point. Would you like to respond to that, or would anybody else like to respond to that?
Well, I can only respond by saying that it is a big hill to climb. We have been working in this area now for the last 2 years and kind of systematically going through literally dozens and dozens, more than 150 different kind of data sources and data sets to begin to identify what kinds of information possibly could be compiled and that has enough global reach, that speaks to different kinds of issues around education, training, and communication, especially according to the ACE framework. It is not a simple endeavor by any stretch of the imagination. And I certainly wish to kind of acknowledge and embrace the challenge that many of the colleagues have spoke about on the panel, that we want to put forward information that doesn't just talk about the quo and the how much the gaps need to be filled, but also finds ways to provoke people to think differently, to develop kind of their imaginations of what more inventive and innovative climate change education and communication might look like. I think there's one area that I would like to just note in passing, because I do think it doesn't get enough. We have, whatever little information we have of formal education, when we talk about lifelong learning and adult non-formal education, and keeping in mind, I think, the important contribution that Sydney has brought forward, there's really a dearth of kind of systematic evidence that we have about the ways in which adults are being brought into different kinds of climate educational formats and frameworks. And partly this is because this is an area where governments don't consistently collect information, but I think it's so incredibly critical in this area of fostering climate action. So it isn't just about focusing on young people and youth, given all their motivation and their time, but also bringing adults who have very complicated and demanding lives into these conversations, intergenerational conversations. I think it's really critical to think much more about how adults can be brought into fostering climate action at some of these system levels that they perhaps have more access to in fomenting real change and dealing with some of the structural obstacles that Christina has brought out.
And I think lifelong learning becoming ever more important as so many young people's education is disrupted by extreme climate events, isn't it? And political and other events. And I think Professor Rosa spoke so beautifully about their experiment and transformation, which is to draw the families of the learners into the process of schooling much more, and in that way bringing previously marginalized voices into the center of deliberating what the climate actions might be that one wants to support in a particular local context. So to bear in mind that the NORRAG special issues have exactly that purpose in mind. It is to bridge the policy practice gap, and it is to really amplify marginal areas of expertise that are not often recognized in the published literature. And I think that this is a wonderful platform. It's an open access platform that hopefully you'd be able to share with those communities within and with whom you are working. Can I ask the panel, if we still have a little bit of time left, in your view, what are the marginalized forms of expertise that really stand out for you in the work that you do and the work that is presented here in your papers? And what might be some of the gaps that actually remain? Any thoughts either unmute or raise a hand. Christina?
Maybe if I can jump in here for a moment. So I think some of the work that I've had the pleasure of working on with some of my colleagues at Unbounded Associates is really kind of critically thinking about the perspective that we bring to the development of climate change education material, or to the way that we identify the risks and vulnerabilities that climate might have on education systems. And part of what we have constantly been drawn to is kind of not necessarily a departure from, but a deprioritization, or maybe not even that's the right word, but kind of giving equal priority to local perspectives that are not oftentimes included in mainstream approaches to thinking about risk and vulnerability, or thinking about solutions. So again, this kind of draws on, again, not trying to deprioritize science, but to say, our sort of Western scientific approaches to understanding risk and vulnerability and the science of climate change oftentimes leaves little room for local and indigenous understandings of environmental change, and therefore solutions to environmental change and adaptation. And I think that, whether that means ways of understanding and identifying what risk might look like for, communities, for different aspects of the education system, really attending to voices within communities that are marginalized. So in this case, thinking about girls and women, or people in communities with disabilities, really beginning to kind of decenter a normative and sort of dominant approach to thinking about, what are the issues and so on. I mean, we can start with, talking about the greenhouse effect, sure, but then what are the other sort of contextualized understandings and experiences of the environment, of our relationship with the natural world and with the social world, that really need to come into the picture when we're thinking about what is it that we're educating about and what for, and I think that the what for aspect is really about recentering social relationships and our socio-ecological relationships in ways that restore balance, not only in terms of planetary balance, but also, again, the social justice components as well. So I think maybe offer that as a maybe point for others to build off of as well.
Go ahead, Rosa.
Well, what I want to say is that it's important to take seriously the importance to have epistemological pluralism in education, and to recognize the different ways of build knowledge. And this is important because in Latin America, at least, we are discussing this in education, and trying to make a move towards an education that includes voices, not only for specific groups, such as indigenous groups, for example, but for everybody. Everybody needs to know about what people do to transform their lives in a daily basis. And also, I think it's quite important to recognize that people is doing things. So it's not the solutions or this transformative education not only comes from science as the only route to see. So I think that this is seen by some people as fashion, or as a movement that it's not shared, but many academics or even governments. But I think it's important to look at experiences on this, and I recommend to look at Latin America in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lupita. And I think the more you'd be able to share with us and write your work and share, the better, because you're absolutely right. You have such wonderful examples, not only from Mexico, but the rest of South America as well. And every time that is opened up a little bit, I just know that we need to connect more across the Spanish, English, French, etc. speaking worlds, as Sarah raised in the beginning. I'm going to give John a chance and then Sydney a chance, and then I think we'll wrap up. John?
Yes, thank you for great examples. I would like to bring forward another marginal form of expertise, the humble expert. We need humble expert asking, how can I be wrong about this, rather than arrogant expert seeking to be right. The great system thinker Donella Meadows said that the scarcest resource is not oil, metal, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other, and to seek the truth rather than to seek to be right. And that is what I'm really looking for.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Sydney, have you got any closing comments?
Yeah, thanks, Eureta. So the gap I found, again, that is affecting the work, especially in Uganda's key sectors such as agriculture, is the lack of climate change in the TVET curricula is leading to the production of extension officers who are supporting farmers who lacking the climate change expertise, the sustainability expertise, and that is also having serious implications for the agriculture sector. These are the people who are in close contact with the farmers, should be supporting them to navigate the challenges that are posed by climate change, but they also lack this expertise. So I find that, as Rosa mentioned before, mainstreaming climate change in curricula is critically important because it creates multiple impacts, even through the students or the graduates from TVET going to work. So transitioning from colleges to work, it will contribute more to the development in the countries, especially in the African context.
Yeah, and I think all of these inputs from educators and the lived experience of situated education could easily perhaps make the policy advisors in the room today think that, well, this is going to lead to policy paralysis, because if we have to bring in so many marginalized voices, and if we even have to interrogate whether science does have the most appropriate answer in a particular context, how are we ever going to put forward a policy? Because policy is supposed to provide direction, right? But let me pull it back to the final slide that Heila presented. If policy itself can be a learning process, a process that is willing to be open, reflexively to adapt. And I think that's one of the really important innovations that we need, is to find a way of not having a policy that has to be adopted, but policy that is in itself reflexive, transformative, and enables learning processes. I really want to thank our panelists for their careful thinking, their wonderful depth and thought-provoking responses. I hope as an audience you have enjoyed them. I want to thank Heila very much for providing so many responses to the questions and answers, and to the members of our 200+ audience for the questions that you've posed and the responses that you've given as well. And thank you very much to NORRAG for organizing this fantastic event. Over to you, Moira.
And I can only add my thanks to those of Eureta and also of Heila for the excellent work that they have done curating this extraordinary collection of pieces from such a diverse group of authors, very thoughtful, beautifully written and beautifully put together. Thank you very much. And so now is the moment that the audience has been waiting for, where in the chat you will find the link to the NORRAG Special Issue number 7, which is now live, and you can read it yourselves, you can share it in your networks, and we very much look forward to hearing also some feedback from you on what it is that you think about that, and how it is that you are able to put these fantastic ideas into practice. The key question here is that how can education support the building of economic and social systems for sustainable futures without losing sight of its educational mission and purpose? And in order to let you in on some other things that we are doing, in addition to this particular special issue, which we know you've come here to hear more about, we also wanted to highlight the ongoing work from this particular project on monitoring and evaluating climate communication and education. And you have in the chat now also a link to this project where you can find out more about this work on climate communication and education. And also an upcoming event from NORRAG with the GPE KICS Europe Asia Pacific Hub and ACER, which is looking at learning assessments and how one can use evidence, or how evidence is being used from learning assessments to drive education reform. If you're interested in that, please do go to our website where you'll find more information to register. And also you can find other experts who are fascinated by the same issues you are by joining the NORRAG network. And there's a link that will also be put into the chat where you can sign up to the network and find those people who care about the same things that you do, happen to be in the same area that you are, to network effectively with them. And also, if you are interested in this new NORRAG initiative, the South Also Knows, which is really addressing the fact that South-North research collaborations are plagued by unequal relations, South-North citations, always unequal relations, and also in terms of research into evidence and for policy and practice. If you would like to join that movement, do email us at the email address that's going into the chat now as well. And our next NSI, which is going to be number 8, guest edited by Michel Carton and Christine Hoffman, who is at the ILO. And it's really looking at how we can break down the discontinuities between the fields of education and training and work in ways that are productive for everyone, and particularly for those marginalized people who are most affected by this. In January, we are publishing a book on systems thinking in international education and development. There's a contact there if you would like to hear more about that immediately. If not, if you would like to hear more about it, you can sign up for the network and you will be kept informed. And finally, we are always looking to improve. So you will receive a post-event survey through a link to your email address. Do please fill that in so we can continue to improve. And also you can join the NORRAG network. The video recordings and events highlights will probably take somewhere between 7 and 10 days to reach you because we want to edit it to the highest quality possible. So finally, thank you to everyone who joined us, all of the panelists, and very importantly also to all of the people who joined us in the audience, everyone who signed up. Over nearly 600 people signed up for this webinar. All of those who weren't able to join us in person today will still receive the event's highlights, and we very much look forward to seeing you again inside our network and also at our next event. Thank you all very much for joining us today.